that's pretty good. So just as a quick refresher, we've been talking about how, like, the book, like this has been a long book report, right? I've been going through the book called Bearing God's Name, and that is covering mainly how as we've historically translated it, the second command of the Ten Commandments is, don't take the Lord's name in vain. And what we talk about is the take is not the word take, it's a word for carry. And so it's like, don't carry the Lord's name in vain. How do you do that? Well, that's why the author of the book, Dr. Imes, translates it as bearing God's name in vain. It's the same word that's used for the high priest whenever they literally are wearing a hat on their head. They're bearing God's name on their head, and they're bearing the tribes of Israel, their names on them. So it's like the whole point is don't bear God's name in vain, which is don't represent God poorly, which is what Israel does from the beginning, right? So now we're going to talk about Jesus. It's like, okay, we've finally made it through the Old Testament. Last week we talked about the prophets, and now we're going to talk about Jesus. So, like I said, we talked about the prophets last week. They spent the entire time trying to call the people back to God. They have gone into idolatry. They have done all sorts of things. They finally end up in exile, which is what God told them was going to happen back in Deuteronomy. It's like, Moses basically says, like, I know you're not actually going to be faithful, like, but it still happens. They need something new. We talked about the new covenant this week. Jesus, you knew we had to get there, right? Do you think that this bearing God's name business shows up in the New Testament? We wouldn't be talking about it today if it didn't, right? So let's look at that. First, just a quick aside about God's name. I want to say, second week, somewhere in there, we did a quick refresher on God's name in the Bible. So in the Old Testament, you'll see all caps Lord, right? Most of your translations have it that way. There are a handful of them that actually translate that as Yahweh. But for tradition reasons, like, it's been translated as Lord. And that is, when Moses says, like, who am I going to say that sent me? And it's like, I am that I am. That's what the name of God is. He says it's Yahweh. It's not, Lord is sort of like a title, but it's like, when it's in the Old Testament in Hebrew, it's not Lord, it is Yahweh. But it's gone in the New Testament. You're not going to see the all caps Lord anymore. You see, like, capital L, but everything else is all lowercase. It's like, what happened there? A few things happened there. The Old Testament was written in what language primarily? Hebrew, right? New Testament is written in what language primarily? Greek. There's a little bit of Aramaic in there too, but I didn't know this. In Greek, there's not actually a Y. There's not actually a W. There's not even an H in Greek. So that's one. It's just not really a good way to say it. But the other reason is really the Jews had decided to just, we just want to be respectful of God's name as much as possible, so we're not even going to write it. So what they would put instead was something like Adonai or something like that, right? So the way that the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they put the word Lord. The Greek word is kurios. So they put that word in there. So, okay, that's going to come up again. But, all right. Let's talk about Jesus now. Through 12. 8 through 12.
Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers and elders of the people, if we're being called to account today for an act of kindness shown to a cripple and are asked how he was healed, then know this, you and all the people of Israel, it is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, both whom God raised from the dead.
It is by the name of who? Jesus Christ of Nazareth, verse 10. Whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead. Jesus is the stone the builders rejected. And then verse 12, salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. So, we've spent Genesis to Malachi hearing God's name. And then all of a sudden, here in Acts, after the Gospels, Peter says this. And it's like, whoa, no other name than Jesus. That's like, what happened? How did we get from Yahweh, the name of Yahweh, the name of Yahweh, the name of the Lord, right, to the name of Jesus here? Let's look at that. All right, Jesus' name. Let's look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. Matthew chapter 1, 21. This is what the angel says to Joseph. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Do y'all know, like, names, Hebrew names meant something? It wasn't just like, I was going to try to come up with a name, like, I don't know, Bob, or John actually has a name. Maybe Bob has a name, has a meaning too. Like, my name is David. It's actually a Hebrew name. It's pretty popular in the Old Testament. It actually has a meaning too. I think it means beloved. Like, anyone know like what your name means? We actually talk about this. Like our kids actually have names that mean something.
I'll say I know my kids, but not what mine means.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not popular in our culture. Well, go ahead.
Deer in Italian and face.
Yes.
My name means bitter.
Bitter. Oh, good. Oh, good. Does anyone know what the name Jesus means?
I've got a handy footnote.
Second?
You got it.
I heard
Savior.
Yahweh saves.
Saves,
Jesus
yeah.
saves. It's
Yeshua.
yeah. It's the same name as Joshua. Did y'all know that? Like, that's a translation thing. Hebrew. So Joshua shows up the first time as Hosea. And it's just like, okay, that just means saves. But then, like, and the only reason we know it's even him is because it's like Hosea, son of Nun or Noon or however you want to say that. And it's like, okay. And then a little bit later, it's like Joshua. So it's like that J thing, that's like Yahweh, like Yeshua. Do you hear that? Yeshua is the Greek way to say that. Joshua, it's the same word. That means Yahweh saves. So when at the time of Jesus, like, it's actually a pretty popular name. There's some other Jesuses in the New Testament, right? It's a popular name because it has a really good meaning. Everyone's looking for when God's going to save them again. That's the name that the angel tells Joseph to name it. Even the prophecy to Isaiah that is from here is, what's the name of the child that I just said it, Emmanuel. I was about to say that Isaiah gives, right? Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. That's from Isaiah 7:14. Jesus doesn't talk about his name much though, does he? Like when Jesus talks, like other people are saying his name, but he doesn't talk about his name. Jesus points to, you remember the Lord's Prayer? Jesus' prayer, hallowed be your name, is not just wishful thinking, as though Jesus is hoping that Yahweh is doing well up there. His prayer implies a personal commitment to honoring that name through a life of faithful obedience. He fulfills Israel's vocation to bear Yahweh's name with honor. So let's look at this. Can someone read Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 23.
Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.
Okay, so earlier I said, when they see the word Lord, they're not thinking just like, sir, sir, or something like that. I mean, that's how they knew God's name at this point. Not everyone who says to me, to God, like that, calling on God's name is not enough. Do you see that? That's what Jesus says. Someone has to follow God's will, right? For one thing, hopefully y'all seen that from, as we've talked about, representing God well, bearing God's name well. That is what the point of the law was. It's actually about representing God well. If someone doesn't follow and represent God well, then they are bearing God's name in vain. That's what Jesus is saying here. It's like you can't just say, yeah, I follow Jesus. It's like you actually have to follow him. You can't just say, I follow God. It's like, show it, prove it. That's what he's saying right here. Look at Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, 5 through 7. Can I get a reader for that?
What verse did you say?
Mark 7, 5 through 7.
So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men.
Did you catch the worship in vain part? You hear that? How it's like, don't bear God's name in vain. Don't take. These people worship in vain. So the context around this right here, people are neglecting the law to honor their father and mother. One of the 10 Commandments. We're also talking about the bearing God's name in here. Jesus is actually elevating the command to honor their father and mother over this thing where it's like they're trying to, it's the whole, I've got something that I'm going to dedicate to God. And by doing that, like, they're no longer honoring their father and mother. Do you remember that story? That's the context of this one here. He's like, no, you can't do that. Because at that point, they can hold on to it. I mean, they're not honoring their parents here. And so he's actually elevating this command. It's like, this is important for Jesus here. And then John 5:43. I can read that one. John 5:43. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. You hear how he's coming in his Father's name? Whose name is he pointing to here? Jesus is constantly pointing to God's name here. And then John 13:15 says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. So he's fulfilling the command to bear God's name. He's showing us how to do it well. So let's look at what it looks like for Jesus to actually live this out. Have y'all ever heard, I don't remember hearing this growing up. There's a lot that I didn't hear growing up, but like different gospels try to write to different audiences. Have y'all heard that before? So like Matthew is really focused on the Jewishness of Jesus. Luke is really interested in like speaking to Gentiles, and he's the one who brings up some of the stories about the women that others don't, right? John is like, he's talking about a whole lot of different things. Matthew really, really cares about the Jewishness part. So this is something that's interesting. When Matthew tells the story of Jesus, Jesus' story, his early life, mirrors Israel's. So, you remember the story? It's like you get Herod wants to kill all the babies And it's like, man, that sounds awfully familiar. Oh yeah, Pharaoh wanted to have all the babies killed too. Okay? So then to get away from Herod, where does Jesus go? He goes to Egypt. Wait a second. That's where the Israelites were. They were in Egypt. When they come back, they have to pass through the Jordan, which is where Jesus was baptized, in the Jordan, in the water. And then after his baptism, where does Jesus go? He's tempted in the wilderness, right? Which is where Israel was. And so a lot of these things here, it's like his early life mirrors this. What happened when Israel ends up in the wilderness? Are there a lot of trials and tests?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah. Do they do a good job of handling those?
Oh, no.
No. What happens to Jesus in the wilderness? He's tempted. He's tested. He does a little bit better though, doesn't he? Now let's look at some of these specific examples here. What does Jesus do to handle, sort of answer the tempter in Matthew?
Oh, scripture.
Yeah. What does he quote from?
Got to be Old Testament.
So, yeah. Can someone read Matthew chapter 4, 3 through 4?
The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God."
Y'all might have a little letter there. Can you see like what book it's quoted from?
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. Oh, what? Let's look at the context for that. Deuteronomy 8, chapter 2, verses 3 says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness those 40 years." That's where Jesus is too, right? "To humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Sounds actually pretty relevant right here. So from Dr. Imes, Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. He was reliving Israel's story, and he was demonstrating his dependence on the Father's provision, resisting the urge to rely on his own strength. Yahweh had called Israel his firstborn son from Exodus 4:22, and he provided for their needs in the wilderness. Jesus knew that his needs will be met too. It's interesting. It's just like, it's not just sort of like this verse pulled out of context. Like, yeah, there's that one verse about like bread. It's like, there's actually like, connects to Jesus' story. Let's look at the next one. Matthew chapter 4, verses 5 through 7. Can someone read that, please?
And the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test."
Okay. Every time I've heard this story before, it's like, uh-oh, Satan knows scripture too. It's like, all right, so you better know it better, right? Have you heard that? I agree. Let's look at this one right here too. Don't put the Lord to the test. This is also from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 16, and the rest of the quote is, "As you did at Massah." It's like, okay, all right. Well, now you actually have to like find out what the rest of this is. That comes from Exodus 17. So the Exodus 17 story is when they say things like, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" That's Exodus 17:3. Exodus 17:7 says, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So they're hungry there. That's exactly what is happening right here. Jesus is probably hungry too, right? It's like, it says he is. He's hungry, thirsty. The people were. I'm guessing they probably weren't as hungry as Jesus was. They had not been going without food and water for 40 days, right? I wonder if Jesus was thinking about that verse, that whole story, while he was fasting. Also, demand for water is not nearly as much of a test as jumping from the temple, right? Like, just a little bit of water versus throwing yourself off of a temple. Like, come on. Jesus isn't even falling for that. So the people were like putting God to the test. Like they're all they want is some food. They just want some water. Like, do you see how the parallel there a little bit, where it's just like the people were asking for that. Satan is like, yeah, throw yourself off. It's like, no, that's not the point. Like, Jesus is not going to test him. He's not even going to ask for food from him. You see how, like, the thinking there? The last temptation is Satan offering a shortcut to bow to Satan. Jesus knows worship is for God alone. Deuteronomy 6:13, it of course parallels the first command, don't make any idols. Also the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? I mean, like all of those things. Like, he just goes, it's like there's so many places we could remember that. And in all of that, Jesus is still faithful. He's following the path of Israel here. He's living out Israel's wanderings, but he's passing the test. Do you see that? Okay, let's look at some of his sermons from Matthew now. Okay, Sermon on the Mount. We had to talk about this, right? Teachings from a mountain. Somebody else did some teachings from a mountain. Right? Moses. Sounds super familiar. Was Jesus abolishing or was he fulfilling? I don't know the answer to this. Fulfilling, right? That's what they're like, don't say. He hasn't come to abolish but to fulfill. He's already been fulfilling Israel's story up to this point, right? Like he's living out the true Israel here. He's also living out totally fulfilling the law as well. How righteous are you supposed to be? You remember that from the Sermon on the Mount? Pretty righteous, right? Unless your righteousness surpasses or exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's pretty righteous. You got to be pretty good. These are the people who knew this stuff really well. I sometimes think like the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, like honestly, they probably knew the Bible better than I do, better than we do. I've heard this said before that they were really good at even memorizing it. They might have the whole Old Testament memorized. It's like knowing it's not good enough. You actually have to live this out.
Was it quantity of like how righteous or how sincere they were? Is that...
Well, I think it's a heart issue, right? It's like, let's look at how Jesus uses the whole of the Old Testament as he interprets the law. So, what does he say? Instead of, you've heard it said, don't murder. Jesus says, don't even hate, don't get angry. But he's using the full story there. Cain and Abel, the first problem there was Cain gets jealous of his brother. He gets angry. It's like he's looking at the whole narrative, not just the law, but the whole story. Instead of no adultery, don't even look. Who was looking from a rooftop? Instead of making oaths, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Well, there's tons of stories about that. Jephthah, he makes a rash oath and thinks that he then has to sacrifice his daughter. He's one of the judges. So he's like, when he goes out, God, if you give me success, whatever comes out of my house, I'll offer it to you as a sacrifice. It's like, what? No, that's not what God wants. Saul and Jonathan. Saul says, if anyone eats anything before we win, then they're going to have to die. Jonathan doesn't hear it. He gets some honey. He almost is going to try to murder his own son because of this, and the people are like, no, you can't do that. Jesus is looking at the whole story. Don't even make oaths. Just say yes or no. Instead of hating your enemy, love them. You can look back at David and Saul there. Saul. That's supposed to say Saul. I don't know what I was doing there. Saul. What was Saul trying to do?
It was getting late, wasn't it?
It was. Was Saul a good guy to David? No. But what does David do? Over and over, God puts Saul into his hands, and David doesn't. The most he does is cut a corner of his garment. And he says, why are you chasing me? Look, I had the opportunity here. Did you see that?
How can I do this evil toward the Lord's anointed is always his response.
That's right. So, Jesus is taking on the whole of the Old Testament story to sort of like help them see, like, you've got to understand the wisdom that's trying to be taught. Does that make sense? And there's tons of other examples of that. The narratives are trying to teach us something. They're more than just history books. There's wisdom there. And Jesus is just drawing on all of it, right? As he's giving this Sermon on the Mount. He defines discipleship around obedience. It's not enough to claim allegiance to Jesus. One must also do God's will. Lip service to Jesus without action that flows out of an intimate relationship is falsely bearing his name. I'm going to read Matthew 7, 21 through 23. Well, actually, we just read that one. I'll read it again, though. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, do we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. So, has anyone ever heard, we talked about this a little. This is a parallel a lot to Moses on Sinai, right? Is Jesus being a new Moses? Sort of. He is on a mountain. He's proclaiming laws, but he's doing so much more than that, right? Here's the bottom line. Jesus is not simply the conduit of God's teachings the way Moses was. He is the source of those teachings. He possesses authority that Moses and the other prophets never had. Moses was only a messenger. Jesus is both the sender and deliverer of the message. Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. He doesn't say, thus says the Lord. His teaching comes from within. I tell you. It's pretty powerful. This is why the crowds are amazed at his teaching and his authority. It's not just his teaching. They are amazed at his authority. He has the authority to say, this is what it says. Let's look at an example of that authority. So Matthew 12 and the Sabbath. Do y'all remember this story? So this is when Jesus and his apostles are walking and they get grain. So they just gather the grain with their hands and they're sort of rolling it in their hands. And they get some of the, what's it called? It's not kernels.
Kernels.
Is it kernels? Okay, thank you. It's I've not done this before. I've heard it actually tastes pretty good. And they eat it. It's okay, what's the problem? It's not about picking the grain. It's the question of whether or not it's work. Because the Torah doesn't come out and say, here's what work is or isn't. It just says don't do any work, right? There's a few examples, don't go out and gather the manna. Get enough the other day, and there will be, it won't get rotten on you, right? So, again, Torah's not, it's instruction. It's not specifically here's all the cases. So there are also this is about interpreting the law. Have y'all ever heard of during Jesus' day, there were different schools of thought on interpreting various laws. So one of them is, I know you know this one. Is there a resurrection of the dead or not? The Pharisees said yes, the Sadducees said no. You'll see how the Bible will sometimes call some of those things out. There's also two different schools there's a rabbi called Hillel and another one called Shammai. They had two different perspectives on divorce. Like sometimes the Pharisees will come and ask Jesus, like, okay, which side are you on here? I mean, this could be like a question about how do you interpret what work is, right? Okay. Well, Jesus, your Pharisees are working on the Sabbath. Do you interpret this differently?
He said the Pharisees.
Sorry. Your disciples are eating and gathering on the Sabbath. Like, do you interpret this differently? They're trying to, like, he could take that route and say, no, you're wrong, it's this. David doesn't answer the same way he does with the divorce. With the divorce one, he goes back to creation. He answers from here. Here, he goes to a story and answers in a totally different way. So he calls them to David. There's this story when David is trying to get away from Saul, and David gets to eat this consecrated bread. So he goes, they've been running, and he goes to the priest, he's like, you got any food? He's like, the only food we've got is the bread that's supposed to sit before God. So it's sitting before the ark. Do you know who's supposed to eat that bread? The high priest, right? The priests are supposed to eat that. Is anyone else supposed to? No. But the priest makes a special exception for the king. So Jesus is saying, just like there are special exceptions for the king, there are special exceptions for me, the king. Jesus is equating himself and connecting himself to the King David here. Then he says, the priests work on Sabbath, don't they? I mean, all of these don't work on Sabbath laws. Who gets to work on Sabbath? The priests do, right? Somebody has to take the sacrifices and all those things. So he could have said, he's equal to the king, that he was, and he's also equal to the priesthood. He's going that way. I mean, the Pharisees wouldn't have liked that, right? I mean, they're already like, oh, he's calling himself the king and he's saying he's as good as the priest. He goes farther than those things, though, by saying he's greater than the temple. So, like, let's look at Matthew 12 here. I'm going to read 12 verses 3 through 8. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. So Jesus is like, I'm like him. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? The priests are okay. So then Jesus drops the bombshell. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. It's not just greater than the kings or the priests. He's saying, like, I'm like them. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's like, whoa, where's he going with some of those things? So, greater than the temple, and then he connects to the Son of Man reference. And he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So, where does the Son of Man reference come from?
Daniel chapter 7.
Daniel 7, right? Let's look at that. Daniel 7. Anyone want to read this? It's verses 1 through 14. Daniel 7, 1 through 14.
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. The beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. How far?
I should, go ahead and jump to verse 9.
Okay. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000s times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened.
Okay, I'll take it from here.
Okay.
Thank you for all, so the beasts, quick explanation. The latter part of chapter 7 explains who the beasts are. The beasts are the nations, okay? The beasts are all raging against God's people, and all of these things, they keep boasting. But then in verse 13, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached what Keith said, the Ancient of Days, and was led into his presence. The Ancient of Days is God. The Son of Man was led into God's presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So it's like Jesus he goes for the throat here. It's like one like the king, one like the priests, and one like the Son of Man. I mean, these are some of the statements that get them riled up, right? He is claiming a lot here. By calling himself the Son of Man, Jesus' claims are enormous. Authority to set aside Sabbath laws, correctly interpret the Hebrew Scriptures, and even to reign over God's kingdom. He is greater than the law. He's the lawgiver. One more on authority. We might have time for a Torah time stuff. That's okay. So Matthew 12, 18 through 21. I'll read this here. Matthew 18. Matthew 12, 18 through 21. So this is Jesus is withdrawing from this place. A large crowd followed him, and he warns others not to tell anyone about it. So Jesus is not saying, "Tell everybody about me yet." He's saying, "Be quiet." And this is what he says: "Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love and whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope." I'm like, okay, again, it's a quote from Isaiah, at least partially. And what I've done here is I've put Matthew over here on the right and Isaiah on the left. It's going to look awfully similar. There's a few differences. I read the New Testament one. The Old Testament one is, "Here's my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice, but will not falter or be discouraged, till he establishes justice on earth, and his teaching the islands will put their hope." So, last verse is a little bit different. Isaiah ends in his teaching, same word as Torah, law, and his teaching is law. The islands will put their hope. Matthew, in his name, the nations will put their hope.
Never noticed the islands.
Yeah, that's sort of like a thing like it shows up where it's like talking about the nations.
Okay.
So, but it's like, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Torah here, in his name. Matthew is tying it to God's name right here. This is one more mountain story. I'm going to have to run. The author of the book wrote this: Jesus plus mountain equals something interesting. Got one more mountain story. Transfiguration. Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light, from Matthew 17:2. It was a glorious revelation. This event has Sinai written all over it. The cloud, the glory, the divine voice. Moments later, they have company. Moses and Elijah, both men are back from the dead, conversing with Jesus on the mountain. In different eras, both had conversed with Yahweh at Mount Sinai. We talked about that last week. Elijah went there too. Both had witnessed Yahweh's glory before their very eyes, but they had only been allowed to see God's back. Now they see his face, the face of Jesus, and it shines gloriously. So I hadn't really thought about, like, Moses and Elijah are the two who get like a personal presence, like they get to see God, right? The comparisons don't stop there. Moses saw God after the golden calf, one of Israel's greatest failures, right after they agreed to the covenant. Elijah saw God when it felt like he was the only faithful one. He runs off because he's like, there's no one faithful. And that's whenever God has to remind him, like, I've got some. Now we have Jesus, another who has and will experience suffering because of his faithfulness. Both Moses and Elijah pass through his life in a supernatural fashion. Who buries Moses? God does, and no one knows where he's buried, right? Elijah gets taken up in a chariot. Peter is just like, this is awesome. I got to build a place, build a shelter for. No. God responds with a simple, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. And through all of this, like, Jesus is shining. He's shining the way that, like, Moses did when he came out and they had to put a veil over him. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 3. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. Their minds were made dull, but to this day the same veil remains when the Old Covenant is read. But it has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed to his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Moses' face shone when he saw Yahweh, but he veiled it because the Israelites could not bear to look at it. Our faces also reflect God's glory, and we experience transformation so that we look more and more like him. Jesus' transfiguration offers us a preview of our own transfiguration. It points to new creation. Jesus' resurrection is the first glimpse we get of new creation. Colossians 1:18 says, Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead. As we gaze at him, we begin to reflect that new creation glory. Jesus shines, not so that we can soak in it for ourselves, but so that we can reflect that glory to others. It sounds a little bit like bearing God's name, right? Reflecting God's glory, what it means to be the image of God. Y'all see that? All right, sorry. I was going to talk about it a little bit more. The last thing was like the Lord stuff. When we say Jesus is Lord, that is not just like a title. Do you hear that? They would hear that as curiosity. Is the word that was used for Lord when they see God. Jesus is God. Jesus is King. Who's the King? God is. Jesus is taking all of those things. So